All right, guys, what's up? Back at it again with another social studies lesson video for you all. Today, we're going to be focusing on the history of the United States, European contact up until nowadays. All right. This is actually going to be Unit 2, Chapter 4, Lesson 2 in your textbooks if you have online access to that. All right, getting into our objectives. So today, what we're going to be doing, today I will learn about U.S. history from European settlement to modern times. So I can understand the history of U.S. colonization from Europe and how it developed into the U.S. we're familiar with today. I know I have it when I am able to discuss with my friends and family the European colonization of the United States and its influence on life here today. All right, so just some vocab for you all. So academic vocab, we've got the word data. For content vocab, we have colonists, manifest destiny, annex, secede, reservation, agriculture, industry, civil rights, and terrorism. All right, so our topics here for today, the three big ones are in red and the subtopics are here in the black text or the black coloring. So early America, we've got European empires, revolution, independence, free republic, living constitution, expansion and conflict, civil war, and economic and social change. And then finally, a world leader, U.S. and global affairs, struggle for equality and mobility and security. All right, so got a question for the first big topic in early America. How did the establishment of European colonies lead to the creation of the United States, the USA? So, European empires, okay, you can see the three big ones here we're about to talk about. So there were European rulers, they were across the Atlantic, in Europe at the time that the Native Americans in North America were just, kind of chilling there. European rulers wanted to expand their trade and they wanted to obtain those valuable resources over in America or North America. So the three big players here from Europe were Spain, France, and England. Okay, so Spain, France, and England. 1500s, Spain actually positioned some of their military there, and they also put out some religious outposts in the Americas. And they actually did found, I believe it was considered to be the largest European settlement at the time in St. Augustine, Florida. So by the end of the 1700s, they actually were settled in parts of New Mexico, California, and Texas. The Spanish did. 1600s, the French ended up owning land from eastern Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so if you kind of imagine like my hand here. So British, they had the colonies here near the Pacific Ocean, and then the French kind of had like pretty much the whole rest of that strip going down from Canada all the way stretching down to the Gulf of Mexico. And the French were also known for trading furs with the Native Americans at the time, okay, because, over in Europe, I guess especially in France, they considered fur to be a very luxurious good, and they saw the Native Americans were very good at collecting fur from the animals that they hunted, and they said, hey, we'll pay a pretty penny, some good money for some of that fur. And then finally, England. So in the early 1600s, England actually sent colonists. Okay, so colonists are just people sent to live in a new place while claiming land for their country. So England sent colonists to the Americas, where they ended up founding some of the earliest English colonies, which would be Jamestown in Virginia. Jamestown is a town that would be in Virginia in 1607, and then Plymouth, Massachusetts, over in 1620. All right, moving on. So, getting into the Revolution and Independence portion of America or the United States. So obviously you have, a whole bunch of, or those three main European countries kind of vying for control or vying for land in America. There's going to be some conflict. Okay, so Great Britain and France actually ended up having a pretty big conflict. They fought the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. The Native Americans actually allied with both. So there were Native American allies on both sides of Great Britain and France. But in the end, Great Britain actually did end up winning, and they won France's North American colonies. Okay, so all that strip of land that I kind of explained earlier with, we're just doing it on my camera here. So that whole strip of land that was kind of like next to the British colonies, that actually used to be owned by France, but, after the French and Indian War, Britain seized control of of that area. So British colonists actually, colonists from Britain, so we would call them, American colonists, but they weren't United States at the time. So the colonists from Britain who settled in America, they actually began to resent. They started to, kind of hate the way the British were taxing them and the sort of laws that they were imposing on them. They felt it was very unfair. Like, hey, we're almost like our own country. We have our own, sort of culture here. Like, we really don't need you all to be, kind of interfering in our affairs. Okay, they want us to be independent from England. So they ended up doing that. They declared independence in 1776, the Declaration of Independence. And England didn't like that, obviously, and that ended up leading to the Revolutionary War. Okay, so the war between Great Britain and the United States, or sorry, the British colonists in America against Great Britain over in Europe. So in 1783, the war finally ended, and Britain did recognize American independence. Okay, Britain was like, okay, we don't want to fight anymore. You've won this war, you've won the Revolutionary War. We don't really want to have to deal with this. So we finally recognize you as your own independent nation. And woohoo, that's actually how the 13 colonies, so that were originally owned by Britain, that's how they became an independent nation, what we now call and what we now live in, if you're watching this video probably, the United States of America. All right, and then over here is the just like a little image of the Boston Tea Party. So kind of tying into this third bullet point where the British colonists in America, so the American colonists were protesting the unfair taxation by dumping all this the British made or imported tea into the harbor because they did not like the very high taxes put on the tea by the British. Okay, so a free republic. So this is our next big topic here with the guiding question: how did the new nation grow and expand? Okay, so now we know kind of like the sort of groundwork for how the United States came to be. So they're now free from the grip of Great Britain. Well, now what? All right. Well, first off, they need to have some laws here. Okay, so they didn't have, Great Britain is kind of like the mother or the father or the parent they kind of broke off from. Well, now they're on their own. Now we need to make up, kind of like a guideline for how we're going to live. They did that, and it wasn't too successful. Okay, so in the beginning, they were considered a confederation. So the United States was a confederation, which just means a loose union. Let me move my camera for a second. A loose union of independent states. And there was actually a government plan set out called the Articles of Confederation. You might have heard of it. It was not very effective. It was way, way too weak. So it basically said, hey, there's a government, but the states pretty much hold all the power. Okay, so let's say the government was like, hey guys, can you maybe lend us some money so we can, kind of, do our government thing? And the states were like, no, we don't want to, we don't want to give up our money. Okay. And so they asked the next state, the other state, the state that would, so the next state over, they would ask them for money, and they're like, no, we don't want to do that, because it was a very weak government under the Articles of Confederation. They didn't have the power to actually even tax the states very effectively. Okay, so the United States citizens recognized this. States were too powerful under the Articles of Confederation. The government was way too weak. So in 1787, there were 55 delegates that met to change the Articles of Confederation. They actually ended up, instead of just changing it, they actually wrote up a whole new constitution for a new national government. And that is our U.S. Constitution, which we still have even today. Pretty much the same groundwork. So the Constitution actually divided powers between the national government and the states. All right, so almost kind of like a shared powers between them. So the national government actually was divided into three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. All right, and all three of those branches were, they basically are kind of like a triangle of powers, and they kind of oversee each other through a system known as checks and balances, which means that it's almost kind of like a weighted scale where no one branch is supposed to be more powerful than the other. Okay, and if you don't already know, executive kind of refers to sort of like the presidential aspect of the government. Legislative tends to be the branch that makes the laws, and judicial are the ones who enforce the law. So like the Supreme Court. Two principles. Okay, so the two underlying principles or philosophies that went under the U.S. Constitution were popular sovereignty and limited government. So POPSOV, popular sovereignty, basically just translates to power from the people. Okay, so the people hold the power. All the power that comes from laws and representatives in our government, should be from the popular vote of the people. Limited government was the second principle, and that just means government only uses power given by the people. Okay, so the government can only act, or only has power within the rules outlined by the people who, kind of put the people in government. Okay, the representatives. The United States also set up a constitutional republic. Okay, or it was set up under the Constitution as a constitutional republic, which basically just means it's a government where the people rule through representatives they elect. Okay, it's not just some king or queen, that just came to be the leader from some bloodline. All right, we actually elect our state representatives, our country representatives. We are the ones that elect them into office. They don't just go into office randomly. Okay, they actually have to be voted in by citizens of the United States. And then in 1789, George Washington actually, so in this year, George Washington became the first president, and that is also the year where the Bill of Rights was added. And the Bill of Rights basically is just sort of like, kind of outlines the basic rights as citizens that we have, such as freedom of religion, speech, press, and trial by jury as United States citizens. All right, so moving on into expansion and conflict. All right, so the U.S. actually stretched, you can actually kind of see it on the map here in the background, from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi. Okay, so right here, this red part, that is actually the United States territory at the time here. So many Americans actually wanted to go even further west. Okay, so past the Mississippi River. So in the 1800s, U.S. actually did gradually expand westward. Okay, so some people just were trying to kind of trickle in a little bit past the Mississippi River. 1803. So by 1803, the U.S. actually doubled in size whenever President Thomas Jefferson bought France's Louisiana Territory, which is going to be extended from the Mississippi River all the way to around the area of the Rocky Mountains. Okay, and the map behind the text here is going to be that purple area. Lewis and Clark expedition. So basically, Lewis and, I forget their full names, but Lewis and Clark were kind of like, sort of like, I want to say they're frontiersmen, but basically they were, I believe they were hired by the U.S. government to basically take some settlers out there and explore Louisiana Territory for a few years. And while they were there, they were able to map the land and rivers they saw, and they recorded data, information about plants and animals that resided in the Louisiana Territory. Like, just think about it. Hey, we just bought all this land, but we don't know what's out there. So why don't we have some people go out and explore it? And so Lewis and Clark, they actually did end up reaching the Pacific over here, and they ended up claiming for America the states of Oregon and Washington. All right. The U.S. actually gained Florida down here from Spain and part of the Oregon Territory from Britain. Okay, so some of these areas were kind of like in like awkward positions where some of them might have, like little patches might have been owned by Spain, and other patches might be owned by Britain. But pretty much the U.S. ended up eventually getting those territories from them. So a lot of Americans at the time believed in what was called manifest destiny, and that's just a fancy way of saying the idea that the United States should go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That was kind of like the mindset, like, hey, we're already here. Why not just take over the whole land, the landmass that we consider, the bottom part of North America, because Canada's up here. So Texas was actually annexed. Okay, I actually forgot to highlight this, but that was one of your words, your vocab words. Annex basically just means it becomes a part of, or it connects to something. Okay, so the United States basically, kind of brought Texas into its other states from Mexico, and Mexico did not like this. They hated it so much that they actually went to war with us. Okay, this is called the U.S.-Mexican War. All right, so war fighting. Eventually, it ended up with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So that ended the U.S.-Mexican War, and the United States actually obtained the areas of California and some of these other Western states around here. Okay. So westward expansion, unfortunately, had negative effects on Native Americans and Spanish settlers, which obviously you probably already know this from history, loss of their land, loss of their culture, and even loss of life, like say whenever they were forced to relocate to reservations in like several hundred miles away, like in like several states away from where they originally were from. And it's just an unfortunate side effect of that westward expansion by the colonists. All right, so moving on, a little bit further on, Civil War. Okay, so we have a whole lot of land. We kind of have the United States is, well, one, it's the United States. We already have our independence, and now we have all this bunch of land and area, and states are kind of developed. People are starting to spread out. But now different ways of life start to arise in both the northern states and the southern states. So in the map behind here, the northern states tend to be the ones over here, kind of like in the blue, with some exceptions to the west. And the southern states at the time are colored in red here. So mid-1800s, the differences actually threatened the unity of the United States, of our country. So the rural South kind of were butting heads with the industrial North. Okay, so the South actually depended on agriculture, specifically cotton farming or cotton picking, and they needed thousands of millions of slaves to do that. Okay, So very slave dependent agriculture. And up here at the top, so they would be what we call more urban areas, so more like city-like areas, rather as opposed to like farmland down here in the South. And a lot of people in the North were actually what we call abolitionists. They were against slavery. They wanted slavery to be abolished. Several reasons for this. I believe a lot of people tend to believe that the reason for why that idea or that mindset tended to be was because a lot of immigrants were coming into into the North, into cities, from other countries. And there's a more diverse population, so there might be a little bit more of a kind of a more progressive thoughts towards not enslaving entire races. So by 1860, the U.S. consisted of both free and slave states. Okay, so free states tend to be the blue ones up here, red ones located down here in the South would be the slave states. Lincoln, who was opposed to slavery, was elected president at this time. And then they were so scared. So the southern states knew that Lincoln he hated slavery, or he was against slavery. They actually seceded, or they left the United States because, they didn't want to be part of it because they knew that Lincoln could, just do away with slavery like that. So they left by early 1861 because they were afraid of Lincoln ending slavery for them. And their economy in the South depended on that. So they ended up creating the Confederacies of America, and they actually started fighting. So I believe the South ended up shooting on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a northern fort, so a Union fort. So the fighting started in April, and that actually began the American Civil War. And again, that was the Union, or the North, versus the Confederates, or the South. So the Union had a much larger population, and they had much better resources. So they actually had better railroads. They had better factories, because remember they have a lot of cities up in the North. So they're able to like transport goods faster through the railroads, and they're able to make goods faster because of their superior factory capacity. But unfortunately, the Confederates won a lot of the early battles, and I think a lot of historians attribute that to the fact that the Confederates just apparently had really good generals. They just knew what they were doing in terms of leading their soldiers. But unfortunately for the South, fortunately for us, the Union ended up winning because of their resource advantage. So those factories and railroads really paid off. They just had the upper hand in terms of resources, getting supplies to soldiers and all that good stuff. And the war ended in their favor after 4 bloody years, which ended up with 600,000 people dead, over 600,000 people dead. The aftermath of that was that our country was united, slavery was abolished, and the federal government was strengthened. All right, and from this, we got new factories, railroads, and a whole bunch of cities were built from the Civil War. Now, so another unfortunate side effect of this, which this has been going on, but this was especially prevalent even after the Civil War. Western expansion did continue, and new settlers set up mines, ranches, and farms. But because of all this constant westward expansion by colonists, Native Americans ended up losing their ancestral lands. They resisted it, obviously, but they were just outnumbered by the vast amount of white settlers that were coming in and basically needing their resources because they needed to fuel their cities and living areas. So the Native Americans were finally forced to live on areas of land set aside for them called reservations. And you can see here in this image, this should be an image, if I'm not mistaken, the Trail of Tears, where Native Americans were basically forced off their ancestral land in the southern United States, and I believe they had to go up kind of like towards the Oregon area in the north, very far, and this actually resulted in a lot of them dying because they just trekking that long, even if you have like horses and carts like this, it's just not really feasible, especially given the disease that tended to be rampant from this time. Okay, so if you didn't already know, the colonists brought over diseases and unintentionally did affect the Native Americans, and the Native Americans didn't really have good defenses there because it's a new disease and they didn't have the necessary antibodies or even the necessary medicine to combat that. Okay, so moving on to economic and social change. So the economy changed as a nation grew. Remember, the economy is just kind of like how a country makes money. So that changed as the nation grew larger. Americans have been farming the land since colonial times, not just the colonists, but also the Native Americans. So growing crops and actually raising livestock to sell is called commercial agriculture. Agriculture is just the actual growing food and raising live food to slaughter and eat. So good soil and constant rain make the eastern U.S. and Pacific Coast area two of the best places for this agriculture. So slavery ended, but unfortunately, laws were still being passed, especially in the South, that limited the rights of freed African Americans. Okay, you have to think. Uh, a lot of white people at the time didn't really have, or the white colonists or the people that were living in the United States at the time, they didn't really have a whole lot of. They just weren't used to kind of being with people of different colors, such as African Americans. Okay, so unfortunately, this kind of led to this ignorance where they didn't really, even though they weren't slaves anymore, because slavery was abolished, there was still this like sort of really just horrible time where they were still segregated against. Okay, so the African Americans, they still had their rights limited, and because of this, they actually ended up moving by the thousands from the South to other parts of the country in the late 1800s, where they could get better job opportunities. Okay, so again, the North still had discrimination, but the African Americans that moved there could actually find better paying jobs in industry, farming, ranching, and mining. We refer to this as the Great Migration. So the Great Migration of a whole bunch of Southern African Americans to the North in order to get better job opportunities. Okay, remember the whole push and pull factors that we talked about earlier in the course. Manufacturing, making, which is just another way of manufacturing, is just making products to sell, usually through like factories. This is what we refer to as industry. People from Europe, Asia, and Latin America, so they are constantly migrating to the U.S. at this time because of this new industry and because of the new opportunities that are being shown to them. Okay, so these pull factors are pulling them towards our country at the time. All right, and that brings us to our last topic, a world leader. So guiding question for this one, what role, okay, what sort of a character in the play of the world do we as the United States have in the world? What role do we have in the world? So the U.S. in global affairs. So like the European powers that we discussed earlier, so the U.S. has kind of really made a name for itself now. So just like the European powers that we talked about earlier, U.S. has a desire for trade, raw materials, and new markets. Hey, we're an awesome country. We kind of made pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Let's keep it going. Okay, let's keep making more money. Let's keep making trade. Let's keep making these connections with other countries. So we did that. 1867, we actually purchased Alaska from Russia for a little bit over $7 million. Okay, not bad, not too bad for the state of Alaska. $7 million, just probably just out of our pockets. Then at 1900, we annexed Hawaii. Okay, so we received Hawaii and we made Hawaii our 50th state. Guam and Puerto Rico actually became U.S. territories after the Spanish-American War. Okay, so something I believe it was like with Cuba. Cuba was trying to get some independence from Spain. America kind of was like, hey, let's kind of get into this war. And, they kind of fought the Spaniards, and they ended up getting Guam and Puerto Rico from Spain. Okay, so they're not states, but they are what we consider U.S. territories. Okay, so we own them technically, but they're not actually part of the U.S. In terms of states. And then Cuba just ended up becoming its own independent nation. During the 1900s, the U.S. actually fought in two world wars, World War I and World War II. So just kind of a breakdown here of each of those. So in 1914, World War I, the Allied powers were Britain, France, Russia, and they were against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary. So the U.S. was neutral, okay, and I use air quotes if you can see them, they're not disappearing from my camera feed. They were considered neutral as in, hey, we're not actually part of the war, but hey, we can slip some money here and there to, the people we like, the people we have connections with, good trade relations with. So they gave this financial support to some of the Allied powers. And eventually the U.S. was like, yeah, what the heck? Let's just enter the war. They did that, but a few months later, or a couple months later, it actually just ended in 1918. So it was like, well, that was silly. Then that didn't last long, though, because in World War II, which happened in 1939, the Allied powers were the U.S., Great Britain, and Soviet Union versus the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The whole thing with Hitler rising to power, the Nazis in Germany. Japan was, starting to invade China. So this basically, again, just like in World War I, U.S. was neutral at first, but they were still giving money to some of the Allied powers. Japan kind of caught wind of this, and they were like, hey, like, you say you're neutral, but you're giving money to our enemies, so are you really neutral, or are you actually part of the war? They attack Pearl Harbor, and because of this, the U.S. is like, nope, that's not going to happen. We're not going to tolerate that at all. And we joined the war. So the Allies, so after the United States joins the war, they're fighting for a few years. The Allies ended up defeating Germany in 1945, but unfortunately, Japan did not surrender at the time. Okay, Japan did not surrender. And because of this, the United States had to make the very difficult decision to basically, they had to ask themselves, are we going to risk U.S. or, U.S. military lives invading Japan, where, Japan, they didn't surrender. They knew the war was lost, but they didn't surrender. They were very proud people. They were not going to go down easily. So sending troops in there, U.S. troops in there, was just going to be a bloodbath. So they had to weigh U.S. troops' lives versus the lives of Japanese civilians. It's a horrible decision, and unfortunately, it ended up being U.S. Dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, which killed thousands, if not, I'm pretty sure it's thousands, but it could even be millions of people in those cities. And because of this, Japan realized that, they were going to keep doing this until we surrendered, and, there probably wouldn't even be a Japan left. So after those two bombs, Japan soon surrendered and World War II ended. After World War II, the United States and Soviet Union actually became the world's two big major powers. Okay, so you kind of think of like being like super buff and like, yeah, we are the world's best countries right now. Okay, but obviously you can't have, they both can't be the best or the most powerful country. So they wanted to compete with each other. They're kind of flexing on each other for world leadership, and this rivalry is known as the Cold War. So it was literally just, pretty much all bark, no bite. They just did it through economics and politics and technology advancements, but there was not actually any fighting. They were just pretty much just, again, just like flexing on each other. Like, hey, check this out. We actually sent Russia, or Soviet Union, we sent out the first satellite into space. And then the United States was like, well, guess what? We sent the first manned flight to the moon. We're the first people on the moon. All right. So that kind of stuff is what the United States and the Soviet Union were kind of like, trying to fight over. They were trying to fight over like technology advancements, political and economic advancements as well. But the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. I believe there was some like internal conflicts in the Soviet Union. They were kind of like phasing out communism in favor of more of like almost like a semi-democratic government system. So that kind of led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, to my knowledge. And the Soviet Union, we don't call them that anymore. They are now present-day Russia. So we just call them Russia now. And I believe that there were some other countries that were also a part of the Soviet Union other than Russia, but Russia was the main one. Okay, struggle for equality. So during the 1900s, the U.S. made strides to give equality for all of its citizens. Okay, they made strides. 1920, 19th Amendment added to the Constitution. This gave women in all states the right to vote. After World War II, so post-World War II, new civil rights just means basic rights that belong to all citizens of the country. The new civil rights movement began. So MLK Jr., I believe he's in here in this photo. This should be the march, the Selma March, I believe it's what it's called. Very important, very historic civil rights march. I believe that should be MLK Jr. here at the front. Rosa Parks, Cesar Chavez. So all these civil rights leaders here. So, Cesar Chavez, I always get confused with some other civil rights, like Hispanic civil rights leaders. But I believe he, I don't want to misspeak on this, okay? But just know that Cesar Chavez was a civil rights leader. So all three of these and others used peaceful methods such as marches, protests, and boycotts that led to social change and greater equality. In response, they're combating inequalities here, laws that they see as unfair, that they don't treat them, other marginalized races, as fair and equal. So in response to this, in response to these protests and the publicity that's being shown here, like these photos taken of the Selma March, U.S. made laws ending segregation. Okay, there was a lot of social, political pressure. Like, hey, like look at these people. Like, you're going to keep letting this happen in the United States? Like, come on, what are you going to do about it? Well, the United States felt pressured, and they made those laws ending segregation. 1954, the Supreme Court ruled against racial segregation. Segregation just means separation in public schools. In 1964, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which pretty much banned the segregation, public segregation, like water fountains, the bathrooms, all that stuff. They couldn't separate blacks and whites anymore. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which basically allowed, pretty much any person of any race the right to vote, which is awesome. And finally, our last slide, last thing, kind of like almost sort of modern times now. So U.S. has seen several changes since World War II. Since then, the population has actually doubled. So 1950, there was like 150 million people. Now, well, not really now, but around the time of 2010, that doubled to 300 million from 1950. After World War II, the U.S. experienced an economic boom. Economic boom just means like our economy was like, whoa, we're getting so much money now. So more people buying homes, excuse me, which led to the building of the suburbs. Suburbs are just like areas around cities, like residential areas around cities, like where just a bunch of people live. And because of those suburbs, more and more people needed cars to go to and from work, to commute to the city. The U.S. became way more mobile. In fact, in 1954, the Interstate Highway Act was passed, and that provided funds, still provides funds for constructing interstate highway systems across the country. We did not even have highways going across states here in the United States until after 1954, which is kind of a crazy thought. I mean, there were still like roads and stuff in the states, but the actual highways connecting the states together wasn't really a thing until 1954 and after that. So we've talked about this here. Since 2000, the U.S. has faced challenge from constant growth of terrorism at home and abroad. Okay, so 2001, as we've talked about, 9/11 terrorist attacks on World War Trade Center and the Pentagon. As a result of this, the U.S. tightened security significantly afterwards, and they actually instituted, I think like a few days later after the attacks, Homeland Security, which is basically, I think it's like now its own separate branch of the government, not branch of the government, but kind of like a sort of like a sub branch kind of, or sub office of the government that basically does all it can to protect American citizens from terrorist attacks, whether they be from foreign terrorist attacks or foreign countries doing terrorist attacks, or even here in the States. And the U.S. carried out a war against terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq because, according to Intel, I believe that is where they kind of located and knew Al-Qaeda, because remember, Al-Qaeda was the terrorist organization behind the 9/11 attacks, or the ones who were responsible for them. That is where they kind of located their main bases of operations, all right? And that is pretty much, well, obviously, it's kind of like a little, like 10 years ago, 2010 or 2001. So about 20-ish, 10-ish years ago that we're talking about here on the slide. But for the most part, we're pretty much caught up with the United States now. And that's it, guys. So I hope you all learned something today about United States history. If you were taking notes, or maybe if I was going a little too fast, you can always go ahead and check out the video in Schoology, or you can check out the PowerPoint slide. Do not forget to do the comprehension check for today's lesson, or from today's lesson video here. And I hope you all have a great, amazing rest of your should be Thursday, right? Take care, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.